The Vanishing Forest. Mark, Lisa, and Brian had been friends since childhood. They did everything together: school projects, summer vacations, and even their first road trip when they turned 18. Now, a few years later, they wanted to do something different, something exciting. That's when Brian suggested camping in Black Hollow Forest. Are you serious? Lisa asked, raising an eyebrow. People say that place is cursed. Brian chuckled. Come on, those are just stories. No one actually believes that, right? Mark shrugged. I don't know. I mean, people have disappeared there. It's kind of creepy. But that's what makes it fun. Brian grinned. It'll be an adventure. Lisa sighed. She wasn't convinced, but Brian's excitement was contagious. Mark, on the other hand, didn't want to seem like a coward. So, after some convincing, they packed their bags, loaded up Mark's car, and drove toward Black Hollow Forest. The journey begins. The drive took a few hours, with the last stretch leading them down an old dirt road. Trees lined both sides, tall and thick, making it feel as if they were entering another world. The deeper they drove, the darker it became, even though the sun was still up. I don't like this, Lisa muttered, hugging her backpack. Oh, come on. It's just trees, Brian said, rolling his eyes. We'll set up camp, tell scary stories, and have a great time. Mark glanced at the GPS. There's no signal anymore. Lisa groaned. Great. No signal. No way to call for help if something happens. Relax, Brian said. Nothing's going to happen. After another 20 minutes, they finally found a clearing to set up camp. They parked the car near the edge of the trees, grabbed their gear, and got to work. Mark pitched the tent while Brian gathered firewood. Lisa sat on a rock, watching the trees, her arms crossed. This place feels wrong, she said. Brian smirked. That's just your imagination. Mark, however, felt uneasy too. The trees stood unnaturally still, not even a breeze moving through them. There were no birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just silence. The first night as night fell, they sat around the fire, eating roasted marshmallows and sharing stories. Brian, of course, told the scariest one. They say if you hear whispers in the forest at night, you should never follow them, he said, his voice low and eerie. Because if you do, you'll never come back. Lisa shivered. Can we talk about something else? Brian laughed. Fine, fine. Eventually, they crawled into their tent, exhausted from the long day. Lisa fell asleep quickly, while Mark and Brian whispered for a while before drifting off. The whispers sometime in the middle of the night. Mark woke up. He didn't know why at first, but then he heard it. Whispers. Soft, barely there, coming from just outside the tent. His heart pounded. He turned to Brian and Lisa, but they were both asleep. Slowly, he unzipped the tent flap and peeked outside. Nothing, just darkness. The fire had burned out, and the trees loomed over them like silent watchers. He held his breath, listening. The whispers stopped. Maybe it was the wind? He wasn't sure, but he didn't want to wake the others over nothing. Taking a deep breath, he lay back down, trying to convince himself it was his imagination. Brian is gone. Morning came with a cold breeze. Mark stretched and sat up, expecting to see Brian and Lisa, but something was wrong. Brian's sleeping bag was empty. Lisa stirred awake. What's wrong? She asked, rubbing her eyes. Mark pointed. Brian's gone. Lisa sat up, looking around. Maybe he went to get firewood? Mark nodded, hoping that was the case. But something felt off. Brian wasn't the type to wander off without saying anything. After waiting for over an hour, they decided to look for him. They called his name, walked through the trees, but there was no sign of him. The deeper they went, the more lost they felt. The forest seemed different. The trees looked twisted, their trunks bending in strange ways. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe. Mark stopped. "Do you hear that?" Lisa frowned. "Hear what?" Mark listened. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves. Then, footsteps. Lisa grabbed his arm. "Brian?" she called. No answer. Then, a whisper. "Go back." They spun around, but no one was there. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Lisa was shaking. "We need to get out of here." Mark nodded, but when they turned back, the path they had come from was gone. Lisa disappears. They ran through the forest, desperate to find their way back to camp. Every turn led them deeper into the unknown. The trees stretched taller, their branches like clawed fingers reaching for them. Lisa tripped, falling hard onto the ground. Mark rushed to help her, but when she looked up at him, her face was pale. "Mark," she whispered, "someone's behind you." Mark turned. Nothing. When he looked back at Lisa, she was gone. "Lisa?" he shouted, spinning around. "Lisa!" His voice echoed, swallowed by the silence. Panic surged through him. He was alone. Completely alone. Then, the whispers returned. "Leave now, or stay forever." The escape Mark ran. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to get out. The trees seemed to shift around him, blocking his way. He tripped over roots, his arms and legs covered in cuts from the brambles. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him. Then, light, a faint glow ahead. He pushed forward, running faster than he ever had before. The trees thinned, and suddenly, he stumbled onto a dirt road. He gasped for air, looking back at the forest. It was gone. Where the trees had stood just moments before, there was only an empty field. Lisa and Brian were never found. Mark never spoke about what happened, but he never camped again. And every now and then, when the wind was just right, he swore he could still hear the whispers, calling him back to Black Hollow Forest. The forgotten highway Jake had been driving for hours. He was exhausted, his eyes heavy, but he was almost home. The familiar roads of his small town were quiet at this hour, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. He hummed to the low music on the radio, trying to keep himself awake. Then, he took a wrong turn. It wasn't on purpose. His mind had wandered for just a moment, and before he realized it, he was on an unfamiliar road. He frowned, gripping the wheel tighter. The road ahead was long and dark, stretching endlessly with no signs, no exits, and no other cars in sight. Jake's heart began to beat a little faster. He checked his phone, but there was no signal. "Great," he muttered under his breath. He glanced at his gas gauge. It was getting lower by the minute. He needed to find a way back to the main road, fast. He kept driving, expecting to see an intersection or a familiar landmark, but nothing changed. The road stayed the same, dark, empty, endless. The longer he drove, the more uneasy he felt. Something about this highway wasn't right. Then, up ahead, he saw something. A gas station. Relief washed over him. Finally, a place to stop and ask for directions. As he pulled in, He noticed how old and run down the gas station looked. The single flickering light above the pumps barely lit the area. The windows were dusty, and the sign above the door was faded beyond recognition. A man stood behind the counter inside the small station. He was thin, almost too thin, with pale skin and dark, sunken eyes. He didn't move as Jake parked the car. He just stared through the window, unblinking. Jake hesitated. Something about this place felt off, but he needed gas, and he needed directions. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of his car and walked inside. The air inside smelled musty, like old wood and dust. The shelves were nearly empty, holding only a few outdated snacks and dusty cans. The man behind the counter didn't speak as Jake approached. "Hey," Jake said, forcing a polite smile. "I think I took a wrong turn. Can you tell me how to get back to the main road?" The man stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking. His voice was slow, almost hollow. "You're already too far." Jake frowned. "Too far? What do you mean?" The man didn't answer. He just kept staring, his face emotionless. A chill ran down Jake's spine. Something about the way the man looked at him made him want to leave immediately. "Never mind," Jake muttered, turning back toward the door. He hurried outside and got into his car. As he started the engine, he glanced at the gas station one last time. The man was still standing in the exact same position, staring at him through the window. Jake shuddered and drove away. But as he drove, his heart pounded in his chest. The road stretched endlessly ahead, just as it had before. No turns, no exits, just the same dark highway. He drove for miles, but nothing changed. Then he saw it again. The gas station. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had been driving in a straight line. There was no way he had circled back. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. He slowed down, staring in disbelief. The same flickering light, the same dusty windows, and inside, the same man standing behind the counter, staring at him. Panic surged through Jake. He pressed his foot on the gas pedal and sped past the station, determined to get out of this nightmare. The road had to lead somewhere. He just had to keep going. But after another hour of driving, the same gas station appeared again. Jake slammed the brakes. His breathing was heavy. His hands were shaking. He couldn't understand what was happening. He pulled over, gripping the steering wheel as fear settled deep in his chest. His phone was still dead. His gas was almost gone. And the road stretched endlessly in both directions. A crackling sound filled the car. The radio had turned on by itself. Static. Then, whispers. Jake's blood ran cold. He reached for the radio dial, but the whispers grew louder. He couldn't understand the words, but they sent chills down his spine. Then, as suddenly as it started, the whispers stopped. Jake let out a shaky breath. He looked up at the rearview mirror. Someone was sitting in his back seat. A wide, eerie smile stretched across the stranger's face. Their eyes were empty, hollow, staring straight at him. Jake screamed and scrambled to open the door, but his hands fumbled. The figure in the back seat didn't move, just smiled wider. The lights of his car flickered. The engine sputtered. Darkness swallowed everything. The next morning, a passerby found Jake's car on an abandoned stretch of road. The engine was still running. The headlights were on, casting an eerie glow on the empty highway. But the driver's seat was empty. Jake was never seen again. The lighthouse that shouldn't exist Emily and her brother Sam never expected their weekend boat trip to turn into a nightmare. They had planned everything carefully: food, water, a map, but the ocean had other ideas. A sudden storm appeared out of nowhere, with winds so strong that their small boat drifted off course. The compass spun wildly, the waves crashed against the hull, and soon they were completely lost. By the time the storm passed, they found themselves near an unfamiliar shore. The beach was long and empty, with dark cliffs in the distance. The sky was still covered in heavy clouds, blocking the moonlight. "We need to find help," Sam said, pulling the boat onto the sand. His voice was calm, but Emily could tell he was worried. She hugged herself against the cold. "Where are we?" "I don't know," Sam admitted, "but we can't stay here all night. Let's look around." As they walked along the shore, a thick fog started rolling in. It moved fast, swallowing everything behind them. The beach, the boat, gone. Only the cold mist surrounded them now. Then they saw it. A tall, dark lighthouse stood on a cliff ahead, its light flickering weakly. It looked old, forgotten, as if it had been there for centuries. Yet something felt strange about it. They hadn't seen it before, even though it was so close. "We should go," Emily whispered, her stomach twisting in fear. "But we need shelter," Sam argued. "And maybe there's someone inside who can help us." Reluctantly, Emily followed him toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of salt and something else, something old and rotten. The ground beneath their feet felt damp, almost like they were stepping on something soft instead of solid earth. When they reached the lighthouse, the heavy wooden door creaked open before Sam could even touch it. Emily shivered. "That's not a good sign." Sam stepped inside first. The air was colder than outside, thick with dust and the scent of mildew. The floor was made of stone, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. "There's nobody here," Emily said. "Maybe we should leave." Sam ignored her and moved deeper inside. "Look at this," he said, pointing at the walls. Emily hesitated, then stepped closer. Lining the walls were old photographs. Each one showed a different person, but their faces were twisted in horror. Eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams. A chill ran down Emily's spine. "What is this?" Sam turned to her, his face pale. "I don't know. But these pictures, they look real." Suddenly, he stopped and pointed at one particular photo. "Emily?" he whispered. "Look." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The photo shows them, their own faces, their own clothes. The date underneath was a day, as her heart pounded. "This doesn't make sense," she gasped. "We need to get out of here," Sam said. He turned toward the door, but it was gone. Only a solid stone wall remained where the entrance had been. Emily's breath quickened. "No, no, no. This isn't real. This can't be real." Sam grabbed her hand. "We have to find another way out." They ran toward the spiral staircase in the center of the room. It wound up into darkness, the flickering light above barely reaching them. As they climbed, the air grew colder. The walls changed. The photographs were gone. Instead, something was written all over the stone in faded, scratched letters. "Help me. Don't go up. It's watching. No escape." Sam swallowed hard. "Keep going." The stairs seemed endless. No matter how far they climbed, the top never came closer. Their legs burned. Their breath came in short gasps. But they had no choice but to continue. Then, The light at the top flickered. Emily looked up and froze. A shadow stood there. A figure, tall, thin, and unmoving. Its hollow eyes locked onto them. The light flickered again, and the figure was closer. Emily grabbed Sam's arm. Run! They turned and ran down, but the staircase had changed. It no longer led to the bottom. It twisted and curved in impossible directions, trapping them in a loop. The whispers started, soft at first, then louder. Words they couldn't understand. Words that crawled into their minds and filled them with dread. Sam stopped suddenly. Emily, what? He pointed at a wall. The stone was smooth, almost like glass. Their reflections stared back at them, but something was wrong. Their reflections weren't moving the same way they were. Emily raised her hand. The reflection didn't. Then, the reflection of Sam smiled, a wide, twisted grin that didn't belong to him. Emily screamed. The light above flickered again, and the shadowy figure was now only a few steps away. They ran, no longer caring where the stairs led. They just ran. The walls blurred, the whispers grew louder, and the air turned freezing cold. Then Emily tripped. She tumbled forward, reaching for Sam, but he was gone. The world spun as she fell, down, down, into darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was back on the beach. The sky was clear now, the fog gone. The ocean waves crashed gently against the shore, but Sam was missing. Emily stood, looking around frantically. Sam? She called. Sam! Silence. She turned toward the cliff. The lighthouse was gone. No sign it had ever been there. But in the sand beside her was a single photograph. She picked it up with trembling hands. It was old. The edges burned. The picture showed her and Sam. The date underneath was today. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She turned the photograph over, her fingers shaking. Scrawled on the back in smudged ink were 3 words. Still watching you. A cold wind blew across the beach. And somewhere, deep in the distance, a lighthouse light flickered, just for a moment, before vanishing into the night. The wrong train. David had always taken the same train home every night after work. He liked the routine. It was familiar, safe. He would sit in the same seat, listen to music, and watch the world pass by. The train would stop at the same stations, and the same people would get on and off. It was comforting. But that night was different. That night, David worked late. By the time he reached the station, his usual train had already left. He ran to the platform, hoping to catch another one, but the place was almost empty. A single train stood waiting. It was not a train he had ever seen before. It looked older, its metal worn and dull. The lights inside flickered. David hesitated. He checked the station board. The train was listed as the last one of the night. If he didn't take it, he would be stuck in the city until morning. With a sigh, he stepped inside. The train was completely empty. Every seat was vacant, and the air felt unusually cold. David shivered and found a seat near the window. He looked outside, but there was nothing beyond the glass, just darkness. No lights, no buildings, nothing. He frowned. That was strange. The doors closed with a loud hiss. The train began to move. David pulled out his phone to check the time, but there was no signal, not even Wi-Fi. He sighed and leaned back. Maybe it was just an old train, one that didn't get used often. He told himself it was fine. Then he heard it. A soft tapping. It came from behind him. A light, rhythmic sound, like fingers drumming on a seat. David turned quickly. The seat behind him was empty. He swallowed hard and shook his head. Maybe he was imagining things. It had been a long day after all. The train continued moving. The windows still showed nothing but darkness, as if the train wasn't traveling through the city at all. David tried to ignore the uneasiness creeping into his chest. A station approached. But when the train slowed down, David noticed something odd. The station sign was unreadable. The letters were blurred, shifting like they were written in fog. He squinted, trying to make sense of it, but it was no use. The doors slid open with a hiss. Beyond them was nothing. Just pitch black emptiness. No platform. No people waiting. Only a vast void of darkness. Cold air seeped in, making David's skin prickle. No one got on. No one got off. The doors closed, and the train continued moving. David's heart beat faster. He gripped his phone tightly. He tried calling someone, anyone, but his phone didn't even ring. No signal. He tried texting, but the message wouldn't send. Then he heard whispers. They were faint at first, just a murmur, like distant voices carried by the wind. He couldn't make out the words. His stomach twisted as he turned to look down the aisle. The train was still empty. Another station appeared. This time, the whispers grew louder. The doors opened again, and the blackness outside seemed to stretch endlessly. Then, something stepped onto the train. A shadow. It had no clear shape, no face, no features. Just a dark, shifting form, and it sat down right next to him. David's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. The air around him felt heavy, pressing down on his chest. The shadow didn't speak. It didn't turn its head. But somehow, David knew it was aware of him. The train kept moving. The windows still showed nothing. The lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. David squeezed his eyes shut. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. When he opened them again, the shadow was closer. David bolted from his seat. He stumbled down the aisle, gripping the poles for support. He had to get off this train. He ran to the doors, but they were locked. He pounded on them, shouting for help. No one answered. The train slowed again. Another station. The same unreadable sign. The doors opened, and this time, the whispers turned into soft, chilling laughter. More shadows stepped inside. David's hands shook. He backed away, pressing himself against the wall. The figures moved closer, surrounding him. The train started again, carrying him deeper into the unknown. He fumbled with his phone. His hands were shaking so badly that he almost dropped it. The screen flickered. Then, suddenly, words appeared on it, as if typed by an invisible hand. "Don't take the last train." David's breath came in short gasps. He tried typing back, but the phone shut off completely. The shadows loomed over him now, whispering his name. And then, darkness. The next morning, the train arrived at its final stop. The conductor walked through the cars, checking for any passengers left behind. David's seat was empty. The only thing left was his phone, lying face up on the floor. Its screen was still on, displaying the last message he had received. "Don't take the last train." The night hiker Lauren had always loved hiking. Ever since she was a little girl, she enjoyed the feeling of being surrounded by trees, the smell of fresh earth, and the sound of birds singing in the morning. It made her feel free, like she was part of something bigger than herself. She had hiked on sunny days, rainy days, and even during winter when the ground was covered in snow. But one thing she had never done before was hike at night. She had thought about it before. The idea of walking through the woods under the stars sounded peaceful, but something always held her back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was just common sense. One autumn evening, Lauren set out on a hike in the late afternoon. The air was cool, and the leaves had turned beautiful shades of red, orange, and yellow. She had planned to be back before sunset, but she lost track of time. She wandered deeper into the woods, enjoying the beauty of nature, until she suddenly realized the sun had already dipped below the horizon. A strange feeling settled in her chest as she checked her phone. No signal. That wasn't unusual in the forest, but it still made her uneasy. She took a deep breath and turned around to head back. As she walked, she noticed how quiet everything had become. No birds, no rustling leaves, no wind, just silence. She tried to stay calm, telling herself it was just her imagination. But then she heard it, a soft sound behind her. Footsteps. At first, she thought it might be an animal, but the steps were steady, deliberate, and they matched her own pace. She stopped. The footsteps stopped. Her heart pounded as she slowly turned around. There was nothing there. She shook her head, trying to brush off her fear. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe the crunching of leaves under her own feet had echoed in a strange way. She kept walking, this time a little faster. The footsteps followed. Her breath quickened. She wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was there with her. She didn't dare look back this time. Instead, she picked up her pace, trying to stay calm. Then, up ahead, she saw something that made her blood turn cold. A woman stood in the middle of the path. She wasn't dressed like a normal hiker. She wore an old-fashioned dress, long and flowing, as if she had stepped out of a history book. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her face was pale. But the thing that scared Lauren the most was the woman's eyes. Wide, unblinking. Lauren stopped in her tracks, her breathing shallow. The woman lifted a hand and pointed at her. "You shouldn't be here," the woman whispered. Lauren didn't wait to find out what she meant. She turned and ran, her heart racing faster than her feet. The footsteps behind her grew louder, as if the woman, or whatever she was chasing her. She stumbled, nearly falling, but she forced herself to keep going. The trees blurred past her. She knew she was getting closer to the parking lot. If she could just reach her car, she would be safe. Finally, she saw it. Her car. Relief flooded through her as she yanked the door open, jumped inside, and slammed the lock. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman was standing right behind her car. But this time, she was smiling. Lauren's scream caught in her throat. She threw the car into drive and sped out of the parking lot, not stopping until she reached her home. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman's face. That eerie smile. Those unblinking eyes. Lauren never went hiking again. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, she swore she could hear footsteps outside her window.